So this is the second video looking at Introduction to Excel Functions, and we're specifically focusing on the right hand column of the table of functions that I gave you in the lecture. I'm going to start with the second one first, just because it's a little bit easier to start us off with. Concatenate. So concatenate puts together strings of text. So an example where I might use that in a markbook scenario is if I've got your user IDs in column B, I might want your email addresses, which are based on your user IDs. So I'm going to put the same, they've all got the same ending, which is I'm going to enter as text. I'm putting it in quotation marks because I want it to be text, and if I don't put it in quotation marks, Excel will try and do something and say it doesn't recognise what I'm trying to do with an @ sign. It'd be good if I could spell correctly. So that is the end of all your email addresses. If I then want to put those together with your student IDs, I can take the first piece of text, your ID, comma, the second piece of text, the end of the email address, close brackets, and that's put them together. And that's now your student ID. If I want to copy that down, I also need to stick the ending, because they're all the same. They're all referring back to that cell J2. And there I have 10 student IDs, 10 student emails. Simpler way of doing that, or a different way of doing that, rather than using concatenate, I can just click in the student ID, use the ampersand feature, and then use J2. And again, if I was going to copy that down, I would need some $signs on J2. But that will work just the same way as concatenate. Another useful feature is indirect. So indirect as a function, it returns to you whatever is in a cell that you've specified by some text. So for example, I know in cell J3 here we have a student email address. So if I jump to the bottom, I could say indirect has to be the reference has to be text. So if we're just typing it straight into the brackets, we need quotation marks. So that, when I hit return, will show me whatever is in cell J3. Now that on its own may not be particularly useful, but I might want to know how many marks did was the total. What was the total marks for the exam or the first piece of work? And I might not know how many students there were in the group. I might be able to continually add. I want it to always tell me the total number of marks attained. So I can say that by saying indirect. I know it's in column C, but I don't know, ampersand, I don't know how many rows there are. I don't know how many rows of students there are. So I can say, if I know where it finishes, this would have been clever if I'd done this and moved those out of the way. How am I going to do this? I'll count the email addresses. So I can say equals indirect. We're wanting column C. And we don't know how many students there are, but we know how many email addresses there are. So we want and count how many cells are filled in column J. So that will tell us that there are 11 rows filled in column J. So that's going to return us C11. Well, actually I want C13 because I've got 2 heading columns as well. So I can say +2. And that tells me the maximum mark. If I then insert another row, excuse me, with another student ID, this has automatically detected here that I've added another row and I've got some more data. This has automatically detected that I've put another row in because there's an extra row filled in here, so it's still returning me the same sum. And if I gave them a mark, it would update that number at the top. And that's very useful for large data sets. There's also some statistical tools built into Excel, as you might expect, and they're very useful if you've got a series of student marks to analyse. So for instance, I can find the median, so equals median, and then just highlight the number of cells I want it to analyse, and it lines all of those cells up in ascending order and returns me the middle value. And as you can see, the middle value doesn't have to be a value from the list, it is literally halfway in the middle of the data set. Similarly to that, you've probably covered these together if you've learnt statistics before. We can go look at quartiles, so I can go quartile 1, quartile 2, quartile 3. I'll put Q4 and you should notice some things about that. Add Q2, you'll notice something, so we can say equals quartile. So from these numbers, which quartile am I interested in? So if I put 0, I will get the minimum value. If I put 1, I will get the first quartile. So 25% of people got 40.5 or below. If I excuse me, if I were to stick that array, and rather than saying 1 there, I was to say right of E19 for 1 character, that's then going to look in the same array, but it's going to read the first quartile, and I know it's the first quartile because I've taken the 1 from this bit here. And I can copy that down then, and it will automatically update for me. So Q2 is exactly the same as the median. Q3 is the upper quartile, so that's 74.75% was the mark achieved by 75% of the students in this sample, and the maximum is Q4, so the highest mark was 95%. Skipping on a little bit, we've also got one called text in there. Text is something where you can take a piece of text and you can apply a certain format to it. Now the thing I often use this for is things like days of the week. So for instance, today you can see from my clock is the 29th of the 9th 2017. Okay, well that's fine, and we've done some wonderful sums with that because it's converted it to a number. If I type in here equals text, I'm interested in converting this to text, and I want to see what day is that. So I'll put 3 Ds in quotation marks, and it can tell me it's a Friday, and I can confirm for you today is Friday. If I put 4 Ds, it will return to me the full word Friday. And you can apply various different formats to that text. You can put the month in, the year in, long or short. You can do other things with it as well. You can convert numbers to text in the same way. Okay, there's lots of things. Text can be quite useful if you're after converting a string of numbers to a text string, and it may be worth looking up all the different things you can apply to that. That's probably a video in its own right. Next one we've got round and int. So round and int do very similar things. If I put the number 15.5 there, I'll put round and I'll put int just so you know what they're doing. So if I was to round that cell to no decimal places, I get 16. And if I was to int, so make it a whole number, I get 15. So rounds exactly how you'd expect it to. If you were doing a maths question, you would round that up to 16. Int takes the whole number and removes any additional decimal places. So it just chops the decimal places out. So if I was to put 15.4, now both say 15 because the round is rounding it down to 15. The int has just chopped the 0.4 off. So round is probably more useful for things where you're looking at maths questions and you want to round correctly. Int is possibly for maybe safety factors, tolerances, where you don't want to round up and overestimate something and maybe make a mistake and make something unsafe or unstable. We've also got and or. So and or. If I was to look at a logic test, so an if statement, I could say, rather than putting one test on at a time, I could apply two tests. So if and that equals 15.4, comma, that equals, sorry, it's the same cell, and that equals 15, close brackets. So they're the two things it's testing. Then I want it to show y, I want to show n, and we know it's going to do that because we know how it's working, so that's going to say yes. So both that is 15.4 and that shows 15. If I were to take one of those out, then it says no. Or works in a very similar way, apart from only one of those tests has to be true to get the positive result. So either that has to be 15.4 or this has to be 15. So that says yes, the test is met, one of them is 15.4, the other is 15, and if I delete that, it still says yes, because the test is still being met, because that still says 15.4. Okay, so or you only have to meet one test, and you have to meet all of them. We also have address. So if I were to type address, oops, let's spell it right. Sorry. And put a row and a column number in there. So row 1, column 2, that would be cell B1. So that might be useful if you want an address, you know a particular row or column you're interested in, and you want to use it in an indirect. So you could put, rather than just having that on its own, you could have indirect and that's saying 0 because actually in B1 there is nothing. If I type something, then suddenly indirect address 1, 2, it's picking up from this one over here. Okay. If error is one I suggest you use, do not use it liberally. So if I type something and there is an error, so let's equals this number divided by 0. Okay, oh dear, Excel doesn't like dividing by 0. Perhaps if we said divided by this cell here. So there's clearly an error because that's a 0. If I put a number in here, it's quite happy. If I take the 0, if I put 0, it's not happy. I can put if error. I tell it what I want it to do. So if I want it to do this sum here, comma, if that returns an error, which in our case is a divide by 0 error, then for me I just want to show a blank cell. You can get it to do another sum, you can get it to do a lookup, you can get it to do anything if there's an error. I'm just going to show a blank cell because it just makes it look a bit tidier. Okay, so while I've got a 0 there, there's a blank cell. If I change that number, it does what I ask it to, and it does that sum F21 over G21. Now the reason I say use that wisely is that don't go putting in if errors everywhere until you're satisfied that all of your worksheet and your equations in it work properly how you want them to. Because if you're using this if error, it's much more difficult to track where something is going wrong easily because it's hiding all the bits that you might use to track. Last few, we've got rand. So rand does what it says on the tin. So it just gives you a random number. If I push F9 on the keyboard, that recalculates the sheet. So that constantly changes the random number. I believe somebody showed me this the other day. If I type this, but I don't hit return if I push F9 on the keyboard, then I've now got a fixed random number. So I can hold F9 down. The top one where I hit return after typing it constantly changes. The bottom one, you can see in the function bar, is now static text. So it's found a random number and just fixed it as text. thank you to whoever showed me that the other day. There's also rand between. So very similar to rand, apart from we can specify a lower bound and an upper bound. So I can do a rand between two numbers. Again, if I hit return, it does that. Let's see if we can fix it. I assume it fixes in the same way. If I spell it right. It does. Okay, so that works exactly the same. The final two of the right-hand column that we were looking into were row and column. So, for instance, I know that this cell here, N1, is the first row. So if I were to type that, it will say 1 because it's row 1. If I was to type in here column, it will say 14 because it is column 14. N is the 14th column of the 14th letter of the alphabet. If you want to check that, you can sit and count on your fingers now. But what I can do there is I can define rows and columns. So I can say if a particular cell is filled in. So perhaps let's leave those in. But if I want to say equals if, so if there is a mark. So if it's not blank, so if C3 is not blank, so that's the less than the greater than sign, blank, comma, then I want to show a blank cell, otherwise I want to show the row number. So this isn't blank, so it shows me nothing. If I copy that down to all of my cells, I can see in row 11 there is a blank cell. So somebody didn't submit this piece of work. What I can then go away and do is at the bottom I can say equals count. I've already shown you how to count, but I could count how many numbers there were in here. But I could also look up those numbers and I could work back and work out. So who was the first person not to submit? So equals indirect. Which student didn't submit first? Well, the student IDs are in column B. And then which row am I interested in? Well, I'm interested in the minimum of these. It's the first student in my list not to submit. Whoops, what have I done wrong? Ampersand. That was my first student not to submit the work. And the final two that aren't in your list, but you might want to, you might be interested in. I might want to do total marks. So let me tell you the function first. SUMIF and SUMIFS. So they're very similar to COUNTIF and COUNTIFS. So SUMIF, I'll put a minus in there. So I need a range, so that's my range. I need a criteria, so comma, criteria, I want to know greater than, oops, quotes, greater than 40. So the total marks greater than 40, don't need to copy that, are 462. So from that column, if I had all the marks greater than 40, it adds up to 462. So everybody that passed, I could work out the average pass mark and the average fail mark. I could also do SUMIFS. So the sum range, so I want to add up these marks, but I can specify a different criteria range. So I can specify, okay, I only want to add these marks up if they pass this piece of work. And what's the criteria for passing? So the criteria is being greater than 40. So what that's going to do is that's going to say for everybody that got greater than 40 here, what was the sum of their first piece of work? The sum of the marks of the first piece of work. Okay. So in this particular instance, for a mark book, and what I've just done, that is not particularly useful, but to apply a criteria to one set of cells and add another set of cells together might be useful for you in future pieces of work. That concludes the second part of the introductory video to Excel functions. What I'll go on to do in the final video for topic 1, which I may break into parts depending on how long I talk for, is I will go through some of the New York lottery task.